This is a Sichos from Likutei Sichos, Chelek Parshas Tzav, Sicha Beis, and the topic of the Sicha is that in this week's Parsha we learned the pasuk of Eish Tamid Tukar al Mizbeach Lo Sichbe, and we learned the teaching of Rashi on this pasuk. And there are 4 parts in the Sicha. The Rebbe will, number 1, ask 3 questions on Rashi. Number 2, present and reject an answer on all 3 questions, and also present and reject an answer on one of the questions. Number 3, answer the questions. And number 4, present the Inyanim Meflaim in Halacha and the Yena Shel Torah in Rashi. On the pasuk of Eish Tamid Tukar al Mizbeach Lo Sichbe, so Rashi quotes the words Eish Tamid, and he explains, Eish Nemar by Tamid, this Eish, this fire that it says about it, the word Tamid, Hi Shemad Likenba Es Aneris, that's the one that we use to light the menorah, the candles on the menorah. Shenemar ba, that it says about the menorah, La'alis Ner Tamid. It also calls it a Ner Tamid. And the pasuk over here is telling us, Af hi me al Mizbeach HaChitzin Tukar, that it too should be lit from upon the Mizbeach HaChitzin. And so the way we read the pasuk is that Eish Tamid, referring to the menorah, Tukar me ala Mizbeach, should be lit from upon the Mizbeach. And so this pasuk is referring to the lighting of the menorah. Now, b'pashta, simply, we learn that Rashi is coming over here to address the word Tamid, which l'chera seems to be extra. Because if it's in order to emphasize that the fire has to constantly burn on the Mizbeach without any stop, so then it would be enough to state, like it says in the pasuk, without the word Tamid, Eish Tukar al Mizbeach Lo Sichbe, as it indeed says in the previous pasuk, that Eish al Mizbeach Tukar Bo Lo Sichbe. And so what does the word Tamid add? And therefore Rashi learns that the words Eish Tamid are actually speaking about the Eish HaMenorah, which is called the Ner Tamid, also Tamid. And it's telling us that its Tukar, its lighting, comes from the Eish HaMizbeach. However, it's not understood, and there are 3 questions here. The first question is, the whole parsha here talks about the Mizbeach and its inyanim, including the Eish on the Mizbeach. And so how does a din about the Eish HaMenorah come in here, and especially according to Pshuta Shel Mikra? What about the question that the word Tamid is extra? So the addition of the word Tamid can be learned simply. The pasuk says it to emphasize the timidus, that it's Tamid, and also to say it in the positive, not just Lo Sichbe, but also in the positive, that it should be a Eish Tamid Tukar al Mizbeach. And as we indeed find that the Even Ezra, who is from the Reish Pashtani HaMikra, he explains the psukim in a simple way, that's how he explains the pasuk. And although this teaching of Rashi is taken from Midrash Chazal, it's known, as we spoke many times, that even Midrash Chazal, which Rashi brings, they must fit in Pshuta Shel Mikra. And this is especially when Rashi doesn't say something like V'Rabbeinu Darshu. Like over here, Rashi doesn't even mention that it's a Medrash. So over here, it's even more emphasized that this is fully and entirely fitting with Pshuta Shel Mikra. The second question is, besides for there being a difficulty of how this fits in Pshuta Shel Mikra, it seems that it actually contradicts Pshuta Shel Mikra. It seems like it actually contradicts a previous teaching of Rashi. So moreover, Rashi himself explained earlier, in the pasuk right before this one, Rashi says, Riba kan yekidus harbe. If you look at the psukim here, the Torah speaks about a lot of yekidus. It says al moikta, then it says V'eish HaMizbeach Tukar Bo, then it says V'eish HaMizbeach Tukar Bo, and then we have our pasuk, the pasuk right after this one, where it says Eish Tamid Tukar al Mizbeach. And so Rashi explains that Kulin Nidrushu b'Mesachas Yema, all of them are explained in Mesachas Yema. Shenechluku Rabbeinu b'minyan ha'marachos shayusham, that Rabbeinu argue about the number of fires that were on the Mizbeach. What this means is that our pasuk of Eish Tamid Tukar al Mizbeach Lo Sichbe speaks about one of the marachos, one of the fires which were on the Mizbeach. If so, how does Rashi explain in his teaching on our pasuk that it refers to the Eish HaMenorah? Rashi over here tells us that when it says Eish Tamid Tukar al Mizbeach, it's referring to the Eish of the menorah. That fire Tukar me al Mizbeach should be lit from the Mizbeach. But in the previous Rashi, tells us that it refers to one of the fires on the Mizbeach. So not only doesn't it seem to fit with Pshuta Shel Mikra, it seems that this teaching contradicts a previous teaching of Rashi's. And to add to this question even further, moreover, in this pasuk itself, Rashi immediately explains the end of Lo Sichbe, those words, Eish Tamid, Tukar al Mizbeach, Lo Sichbe, and Rashi explains that it refers to the Eish HaMizbeach. So in this very pasuk itself, Rashi tells us that it's referring to the Eish HaMizbeach. So how do we understand our Rashi that says that it's referring to the Eish HaMenorah? Now, in order to answer all three of these questions, we could have answered, as some Mefarshim indeed explain, that Rashi is not changing the understanding of the pasuk of Eish Tamid itself, our pasuk, from its simple meaning. And the whole pasuk indeed speaks about the Maracha, the fire on the Mizbech. And so that answers our first question, because Rashi is not changing the meaning of the pasuk. And it also answers the other two questions, because our pasuk is indeed speaking about the fire on the Mizbech. So what's Rashi saying over here? Rashi is only coming to explain that from the word Tamid, here by the Mizbeach, we could learn something about the Eish HaManera. Rashi is not saying that this pasuk is talking about the Eish HaManera. It's talking about the Eish of the Mizbeach. It's talking about the fire of the Mizbeach. It's just that from the word Tamid over here, we could learn something about the Manera, where there too it says Tamid, and that it too must be lit from the Eish HaMizbeach. So what changed over here is that the pasuk is not talking about the Eish, the fire of the Manera. It's talking about the Eish, the fire of the Mizbeach. And it's just that we have a limud from this pasuk about the Eish, the fire of the Menorah. However, it's difficult to learn Rashi this way, and because of three reasons. Number one, if this is the case, then Rashi should have said something like Rabbi Seinu Lamdu Mikan, or Mikan Lamdu, because it's a limud. It's something that we're learning out of the pasuk. The pasuk is talking about the Mizbeach, and we learn something from there to the Menorah. The way Rashi writes it is that he's telling us what the pasuk is saying. It's not a limud. Rashi is telling us this is the meaning of the pasuk. The pasuk is talking about the Menorah. Number two, Rashi also quotes the word Eish from the pasuk. Rashi doesn't just quote in his teaching the word Tamid. And also in his teaching as well, he explains the word Eish together with the word Tamid, meaning that Tamid is describing the Eish which is in this pasuk. According to the answer we just gave, the only word that's relevant over here is the word Tamid, that we learn from the word Tamid over here, a limud about the Eish Manera, where there too it says Tamid. And so the word Eish is not important. The fact that Rashi also quotes and speaks about the word Eish indicates that the Eish in this pasuk is referring to the Eish of the Menorah. And number three, from the lengthiness of the explanation of Rashi, where he concludes and says, Af he, that it too, also the Eish, also the fire of the Menorah, Ma'al Mizbeach HaChitzin Tukad, should be lit from the Mizbeach HaChitzin, it's understood that Rashi is saying his teaching into the Hemshech, into the continuation of the words in the pasuk, where it concludes and says, Tukad ala Mizbeach, that the Eish HaMenorah, that the fire from the Menorah should be Tukad, lit, ala Mizbeach, from upon the Mizbeach. So clearly this is how Rashi is learning the pasuk itself, and it's not a limit that we learn from this pasuk which is talking about the Mizbeach. No, from Rashi it's clear that this is a pasuk that's speaking about the Eish, the fire of the Menorah, and not the Mizbeach. Regarding the second question, so there are Mefarshim who answer the contradiction between the two teachings of Rashi, and they explain that the pasuk, our pasuk of Eish Tamid Tukad al Mizbeach, if you look at Maseches Yoma, it isn't included in the drashas in Maseches Yoma that from there we learn out how many fires are on the Mizbeach, but rather all the marachas are learned from the previous psukim. Now, how are we going to understand the Rashi then? Because he does quote our pasuk as well. So the way we're going to read it is that the conclusion of Rashi, that Kula Nidrushu b'Maseches Yema, Shenech Luku Rabbeinu b'Minyan Hamarachis Shahayu Sham, the meaning of these words is only a reference to the Inyan and Maseches where Chazal are derish these psukim. Rashi is not saying that all of these psukim are connected to the number of fires on the Mizbeach. He's telling us that all of these psukim that we just mentioned, you could find them explained in Maseches Yema, in the Inyan, where it speaks about the number of marachas. And indeed, if you open up Maseches Yoma, you'll see that the Gemara over there explains how our pasuk is connected to the Menorah. And so the two teachings of Rashi don't contradict one another. Our Rashi is saying that our pasuk is talking about the Eish HaMenorah, and the previous Rashi is not saying that it's talking about the Mizbeach. He's just telling us that that pasuk is explained and expounded upon in Maseches Yoma, in the Inyan, in the topic where they argue about the number of fires on the Mizbeach. However, according to what's known about how precise Rashi is with his lashon, with his wording, it's understood that this answer isn't entirely glat. It doesn't fit in so smoothly. Because if the ending of Rashi is only there to reference the place where Chazal are derish these psukim, then Rashi would have been satisfied with saying, Kula Nidrushu b'Maseches Yoma, as he says many times. And therefore we must say that these words are relevant for his teaching. And Rashi is telling us that our pasuk of Eish Tamid Tukad al Mizbeach is talking about one of the fires on the Mizbeach. And so we remain with the question that the previous Rashi is saying that our pasuk is referring to the Eish Mizbeach, and in our pasuk Rashi is saying that it refers to the Eish of the Menorah. So now we're going to move on to present the main point of the answer and to answering the first question. So the explanation of all of this is as follows. Rashi explained earlier by the menorah the meaning of the word tamid, because it says tamid by the lighting of the menorah, and we know that the menorah only burnt at night. So Rashi says kol layla v'layla kari tamid. Every night is also called tamid, even if it's just burning during the night. It's called tamid. Kameshata emer oilas tamid, just like you say about the oila, which is only brought once a day, that it's an oilas tamid. Ve'eina ela miyem l'yem. It's only brought from one day to the next once. Ve'chein b'minchas chavitin. So too by the minchas chavitin, which the kohen gadol brings. Namar tamid. It also says tamid. Ve'eina ela machatzisa ba'baker u'machatzisa ba'erev, and it's only brought half in the morning and half in the evening. Because of this explanation of Rashi, so therefore, according to Rashi, it's difficult to explain that the word tamid here comes to add to what the pasuk already says, loy sichba. Because to the contrary, loy sichba means that the eish has to burn non-stop, without any stop whatsoever. However, tamid can mean also the tmidius of only days or only nights, and in that itself, like oilas tamid, which is not the whole day or the whole night. So therefore, because of this difficulty, so now we see the difficulty in Pshuta Shel Mikra of learning the pasuk literally. And therefore, because of this difficulty, Rashi learns that with the pasuk of Eish Tamid, the Torah is referring to a different Eish. It's referring to the Eish that it says by it, La'alis Ner Tamid, which is by the menorah. And the pasuk is teaching us that we must light that Eish of the menorah from a Alam Mizbeach. So that answers our first question. Our first question was that this way of understanding the pasuk, that it's talking about the menorah, doesn't seem to fit at all in Pshuta Shel Mikra, because the pasuk in its simple meaning is speaking about the Mizbeach. But now we can understand how it does fit in Pshuta Shel Mikra to explain that it's talking about the menorah. Because to say that it's talking about the Mizbeach brings up a difficulty, it brings up a question. How are we going to learn the word tamid? The word tamid doesn't fit over here. And so the word tamid is teaching us that this pasuk is actually talking about the menorah. And now that difficulty is no longer there. And so what comes out over here is that in order to understand what's the difficulty of Rashi that compels him to give this teaching of his, the difficulty is based on an earlier teaching of Rashi, something that Rashi already taught us in the beginning of Parshas Tzav. He explained to us over there the meaning of the word tamid, and keeping that in mind, when we come to our pasuk, we're going to see that there's a difficulty, and then we can understand that this is what prompts Rashi to explain that our pasuk is talking about the eish, the fire of the menorah. Now we're going to move on to answering questions number 2 and number 3, and a few other points that weren't brought up in the questions. And as we'll see, question 3 is not answered directly. Now, according to this, it's also understood why earlier, when Rashi explains Yekidus Arbe is teaching in the previous pasuk, and we're going to point out a few things that we didn't point out in the questions. Number 1, he doesn't just say Ribakan Yekidus Harbe and rely on the person to count the Yekidus themselves, but rather he brings all the places, including the pasuk, our pasuk of Eish Tamid. Number 2, we could understand the lengthiness of Rashi, because Rashi could have said Arbe Yekidus Kan, which is much more clear and precise. And number 3, we could understand why after saying Kula Nidrushu b'Maseches Yema, he then adds Shenechaluku Rabbeinu b'Minyan HaMarachos Shehayusham. The Rabbeinu argue about the number of fires that were on the Mizbeach. Why does he add this? This is all because Rashi wants to teach us that this teaching of his depends on the various opinions regarding the number of the Marachos. There are different opinions about this. Meaning that also in Pshuta Shel Mikra there are different ways of learning how many marachos there are on the Mizbeach. And Rashi is saying in that teaching of his, that since Riba Kan, meaning over here, by the discussion of the Mizbeach, so it makes sense that all the Yekidus are talking about Kan the Mizbeach. And this fits with the opinion that holds that there were 4 marachos every day. And according to this understanding, also our pasuk of Eish Tamid Tukar al Mizbeach is included in the psukim which speak about the marachos of the Mizbeach. And so also our pasuk of Eish Tamid Tukar al Mizbeach, according to this opinion that there were 4 marachos, our pasuk is included in the psukim which speak about the marachos of the Mizbeach. And according to this opinion, Rashi doesn't have an explanation for our pasuk, that it says Tamid in our pasuk. What's the explanation for the word Tamid? The word Tamid doesn't seem to fit once it says already Leisichbe. And according to this opinion, we will have to B'deichik explain the meaning of the word Tamid as the Evan Ezra explains, or in some other way. And so it comes out that there's actually 2 ways in Rashi of understanding our pasuk. One way says that our pasuk is talking about the Mizbeach, and it's based on the fact that all the psukim here are talking about the Mizbeach, so it makes sense that this pasuk is also talking about the Mizbeach. And another way is that since the word Tamid is not understood, as a result we're going to explain our pasuk to mean that it's talking about the menorah. It's talking about the Eish of the menorah. However, according to the other opinions, that there were only 2 or 3 marachos, as Rashi says, there's a machlekes about the number. So Rashi explains that they have a proof from Pshuta Shel Mikra. Since, like we said, it's more glad to say that Eish Tamid speaks about the menorah, and it's teaching us that it has to be lit from a Alam Mizbeach. And according to this, the Yekidus were Harbe. What does it mean, Harbe? More than 1, but they weren't 4. There was only 3 of them. And so it comes out that according to Rashi, there's 2 ways of learning our pasuk. On one hand, we could learn our pasuk that it's talking about the Mizbeach. since that's what all the psukim over here are talking about. And that's how the previous Rashi learns this pasuk. And another way of learning it is that since it uses the word tamid, and it's difficult to explain the word tamid over here, so therefore we're going to learn that this pasuk is actually talking about the eish, the fire of the menorah, and not of the mizbeach. Now, regarding the last question, the Rebbe doesn't address it directly. It seems that the answer is that explanation of Rashi, that Lo Sichbe refers to the Eish HaMizbech, is going according to the opinion that our pasuk is talking about the fire in the Mizbech, and not according to the opinion that says that it's talking about the fire of the menorah. From the Inyanim Mefloim and Halacha that are in our Rashi, so by a number of dinim that consist of two parts that depend on one another, so the question arises, what is the main and siba part, what is the cause, and what is the mesuvav part, what is the result? For example, by the Shtei Alechem, which we are makriv on Chag HaShavuos, the din is that it must be a mincha chadasha. It has to come from the tfuah chadasha, from the new grain. And before being makriv the Shtei Alechem, we are not permitted to be makriv a different mincha from the tfuah chadasha. And so here the question arises, what is the main and siba part? Is it the Shtei Alechem, that they have to be the first mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha, and as a result of this, we are not permitted to be makriv a different mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha? The Shtei Alechem has to come first. Or is it a din in menachas, that they have to have a mater, meaning that in order to bring menachas from the Tvuah Chadasha, there has to first be the akrava of the Shtei Alechem. Meaning that the reason the Shtei Alechem are the first akrava of the Tvuah Chadasha is in order to be matter, to be makriv the menachas from the Tvuah Chadasha. It's for the menachas. The menachas are their ikr. Says the main and sibba part that the Shtei Alechem have to be the first mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha, and it's only as a result of that that other menachas can't yet be brought from the Tvuah Chadasha. Or is the main and sibba part that menachas are not allowed to be brought from the Tvuah Chadasha until they have a mater, and the mater is the Shtei Alechem. So the main and sibba part is that there's a need for a mater for the other menachas, and as a result of that, that's why the Shtei Alechem have to be from the Tvuah Chadasha. And there will be a nafkamina for several matters, including in the case if we were makriv a mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha before the Shtei Alechem. And the question will be, does the Isser still remain to bring other menachas from the Tvuah Chadasha before the Shtei Alechem? So if the reason is because the Shtei Alechem have to be the first mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha, then since the Shtei Alechem can no longer be the first, so therefore there can no longer be an Isser in it, and we may be makriv a different mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha. The only reason we're not allowed to bring a mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha before the Shtei Alechem is because the Shtei Alechem have to be first. But in this case where they're not first anyway, so it doesn't matter anymore. However, if this din is because we're not allowed to be makriv a mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha before the Shtei Alechem are materit, they have to permit it to be done, so then the Isser still remains even after bringing a mincha from the Tvuah Chadasha. Because as long as we weren't makriv the Shtei Alechem, there isn't the mater to bring menachas from the Tvuah Chadasha. Similarly, in our inyan, when it comes to the chiyuv to light the menorah from the mizbeach hachitzin, we can ask: is it a din in lighting the menorah that the eish menorah has to be from the mizbeach hachitzin, or is it a chiyuv which is taught in parshas mizbeach and so is relevant to the mizbeach, and that is that we must take the eish to light the menorah from the mizbeach? Now, among the nafkaminas in this is, if for whatever reason there is no eish hamizbeach, is a ma'akev the lighting of the menorah? So if it's a din in the menorah that the menorah has to be lit from the mizbeach, so when there's no eish mizbeach, we cannot light the menorah because it has to come from the mizbeach. However, if it's a din in the mizbeach, then it should come out that when there's no eish mizbeach, so then the chiyuv falls away and we light the menorah from a different eish. Now in Allah, it seems that it's a din of lighting the eish of the menorah, that the eish of the menorah must come from the mizbeach hachitzin. However, from this that Rashi changes from the wording of Razal, where they say Eish Tamid Shamarti L'cha Loitehei Ela Bereisha Shel Mizbeach HaChitzon, where it seems that it's talking about the Eish HaMenorah having to come from the Eish HaMizbeach, and instead Rashi writes Af Hi Me'al Mizbeach HaChitzon Tukad, that it too should be lit from the Mizbeach HaChitzon. So according to this, it seems that this is a din in the Mizbeach HaChitzon, that its Eish also, like the other Yerkidis here, like the other fires over here, has to be the one that from it the Eish HaMenorah is lit. It sounds like it's a din in the Eish of the Mizbeach. And especially since this is also the way it's understood in the simple meaning of the Psukim, because the Torah placed this limud in this parsha which speaks about the Mizbeach HaChitzon and not in Parshas HaMenorah. So it seems in Pshat HaShemikra that it's a din in the Eish HaMizbeach and not in the Eish HaMenorah. The hira from this in Avodas Hashem is the kelim which were in the Mishkan and Mikdash are generally divided into two types: those which were in the inside, which are the Mizbeach HaPnimi, the Menorah, and the Shulchan, and those that were on the outside, specifically the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Now in Avodas Adam, this is the two types of Avodah. There is the Avodah of the inside, which is the Avodah with oneself, and then there's the Avodah with the outside, which is to work with and influence another Yid, to be Makarev also those who are on the outside, and also in addition to that, for a person to work with their portion in the world. Everybody has a portion of the world that they have to elevate, and this is similar to the Mizbeach HaChitzon, where they were Makarev the Korbanos of all Yidden, and also as a place of Birur and Yonei Ha'olam. So we have the Avodah of the inside, where a person works on themselves, and then there's the Avodah on the outside. Now more specifically, when we talk about the Avodah on the inside, the lighting of the menorah is the inyan of Torah, as it's written, Kiner mitzvah v'Torah and it's regarding Torah that it says, La'alis ner tamid, just like the chiyuv of Talmud Torah, unlike the chiyuv of mitzvahs, that the chiyuv of Talmud Torah is tamid. And this is especially when it's Torah Soyim Nasei, where then one is a ner tamid, meaning that they're constantly connected with Hashem. Now a yeshiv oil, which is represented by the menorah, can claim that since he can be a lit menorah, and in a manner of la'alis ner tamid, so therefore he doesn't need mitzvahs, not even a mitzvah averis. And certainly, why does he need to have to do with worldly matters, or even with another yid, who compared to the level of a yeshiv oil, which is his level, is considered to be on the outside? In response to this comes the hira, that the menorah was lit from the mizbeach. Certainly there is the mizbeach hapnimi, which is the lofty aveda of a yid with oneself. However, the light of the menorah isn't lit from the Mizbeach HaPnimi, even though it is near the menorah, which the Mizbeach HaPnimi is the Avodah of Pnimis Halev, but rather it's lit specifically from the Mizbeach HaChitzon. Moreover, it comes out from the words of Rashi that the Eish, while still on the Mizbeach HaChitzon, is already connected to the Eish HaMenorah. In Avodas Adam, this means that by a Yeshiv oil, in order to light the Eish and Erev Torah, they have to first care that the Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam should burn and shine by another Yid, and only then can he light his Ner Hashem with Eira Torah. And this connection of the Menorah with the Mizbeach HaChitzon, which is the idea of a person dedicating themselves with the outside, is so important that therefore it's hinted to in our pasuk with the word Tamid. This is because the inyan of Tamid, which is the Tmidius of a Yeshiv oil, is achieved specifically through him going through nisyanis and difficulties of the outside, and by involving himself in working with other Yidden, and then he achieves in his Aveda of Limud Torah the level of Tmidius.